Continuing on our journey with Frederick Law Olmsted through Virginia in the early 1850s, we will run into two scenes during this commentary. The first is a disturbing scene of Negroes being taken to be sold, and the second takes place in a coal mine with Negro slaves and white laborers. And there's also a bonus scene at the end, which includes an eye-opening conversation, which Olmsted overheard, between two slave owners. So you're for sure going to want to watch until the end. But right now, what we're going to do is open up the PDF book right here titled A Journey in the Seaboard Slave States. And we're going to turn to page 30 where Olmsted writes this.
Yesterday morning, during a cold, sleety storm, against which I was struggling with my umbrella to the post office, I met a comfortably dressed Negro leading 3 others by a rope. The first was a middle-aged man, the second a girl of perhaps 20, and the last a boy, considerably younger. The arms of all 3 were secured before them with handcuffs, and the rope by which they were led passed from one to another, being made fast at each pair of handcuffs. They were thinly clad, the girl especially so, having only an old ragged handkerchief around her neck, over a common calico dress, and another handkerchief twisted around her head.
So the Negro who escorted them was comfortably dressed, but the other blacks were thinly clad or wearing little clothing, and they were handcuffed and tied together by a rope. And if this wasn't miserable enough, then imagine being escorted in the type of weather that he's about to explain.
They were dripping wet, and icicles were forming at the time on the awning bars.
Freezing in misery.
The boy looked most dolefully, and the girl was turning around with a very angry face and shouting,
"Oh, Shaw, shut up!"
"What are they?" said I, to a white man who had also stopped for a moment to look at them. "What's he going to do with them?"
"Come in a canal boat, I reckon, sent down here to be sold. That is a likely gal."
Our ways lay together, and I asked further explanation. He informed me that the Negro dealers had confidential servants always in attendance, on the arrival of the railroad trains and canal packets, to take any Negroes that might have come consigned to them and bring them to their marts.
The comfortably dressed Negro was the confidential servant in this instance, who was entrusted with the task of picking up newly arriving slaves and then bringing them to the slave market, just as he did, right? Let's continue.
Nearly opposite the post office was another singular group of Negroes. They were all men and boys, and each carried a coarse white blanket, drawn together at the corners so as to hold some articles, probably extra clothes. They stood in a row, in lounging attitudes, and some of them, again, were quarreling or reproving one another. A villainous-looking white man stood in front of them. Presently, a stout, respectable man dressed in black according to the custom, and without any overcoat or umbrella, but with a large golden-headed walking stick, came out of the door of an office, and without saying a word, walked briskly up the street. The Negroes immediately followed in file, the other white man bringing up the rear. They were slaves that had been sent into the town to be hired out as servants or factory hands. The gentleman in black was, probably, the broker in the business.
The broker's job was to connect the slave sellers and the buyers, hire out labor, negotiate prices, and other related types of tasks. And it appears that the owner had sent the slaves out to town to be hired out, and the broker was conducting some type of business involving their placement, right? Now let's move on to the next scene and watch this.
Yesterday I visited a coal pit. The majority of the mining laborers are slaves, and uncommonly athletic and fine-looking Negroes, but a considerable number of white hands are also employed, and they occupy all the responsible posts.
The responsible posts are the positions of authority and the roles that involved higher decision-making, right? I want you to think about this. Both the blacks and the whites were employed in this coal mine, but the whites held all the higher positions over the blacks, right? This is another one of those societal rituals that communicated to the collective mind that those that they named blacks were at the bottom and the whites were on top of them, right? That's why Olmsted witnessed that the whites occupied all the responsible posts. Understand, and let's keep reading.
The slaves are, some of them, owned by the mining company, but the most are hired of their owners at from $120 to $200 a year, the company boarding and clothing them.
That's what Olmsted also saw previously, when he mentioned the Negroes following the broker to be hired out as servants or factory hands, right? The coal mines was one of the places where slave owners hired out their human property, right? Let's continue.
I have the impression that I heard it was customary to give them a certain allowance of money and let them find their own board. The white hands are mostly English or Welshmen. One of them, with whom I conversed, told me that he had been here several years. He had previously lived some years at the North. He got better wages here than he had earned at the North, but he was not contented and did not intend to remain. On pressing him for the reason of his discontent, he said after some hesitation that he had rather live where he could be more free. A man had to be too discreet here. If one happened to say anything that gave offense, they thought no more of drawing a pistol or a knife upon him than they would of kicking a dog that was in their way.
This is the same report given by Dr. Thomas Sowell in his book Black Rednecks and White Liberals, and also in the book by Dr. Grady McWhiney called The Cracker Culture, right? Both of them mention how violent the whites in the South were reported to be. And as a matter of fact, there's an entire section in this book about the Billies and their backwoods Southern culture of violence, right? Let's hear a little bit more about that. So let's go in here and turn to page 146, where Dr. McWhiney writes this.
Visitors from Europe and the North to the Old South often described white Southerners as a heathen race of barbarians who were
more savage than the Indians.
One foreigner complained that killings in Louisiana, which
would be called murders in France,
were as common as
quarrels followed by fistfights.
A dispute in Texas between Methodists and Presbyterians became so furious, explained a stranger, that
the president of the Presbyterian University was shot down on the street.
Some men in Kentucky reportedly
roasted to death before a large log fire one of their friends because he refused to take a drink. They did it thus. 3 or 4 of them shoved and held him up to the fire until they themselves could stand it no longer, and he died in 20 hours after. No legal inquiry took place,
claimed a visitor from England,
nor indeed ever takes place among rowdies, as the backwoodsmen are called.
Travelers elsewhere in the antebellum South were appalled by what they saw.
Horrible,
announced a Northerner who witnessed several violent encounters.
I would not live in the South for a mine of gold.
And there were so many foreign accounts and accounts from Southerners as well who reported on the violent nature of the whites in the Old South, right? And that's why the gentleman from the North who Olmsted is speaking to is ready to get out of there, right? He doesn't want that pistol pulled on him. And can we blame him for that? We can't blame him for that, right? Let's put this book up right here. And let's go back to the PDF and see what else Olmsted has to say.
Not long since, a young English fellow came to the pit and was put to work along with a gang of Negroes. One morning, about a week afterwards, 20 or 30 men called on him and told him that they would allow him 15 minutes to get out of sight. And if they ever saw him in those parts again, they would give him hell. They were all armed, and there was nothing for the young fellow to do but to move right off. What reason did they give him for it?
They did not give him any reason.
But what had he done?
Why, I believe they thought he had been too free with the nigger. He wasn't used to them, you see, sir. And he talked to 'em free-like, and they thought he'd make 'em think too much of themselves.
You hear that? They thought he'd make them think too much of themselves. The Negroes were only supposed to see themselves as subjects to the whites and beneath them, right? Not on equal footings. And this is similar to how the military is structured in a sense. There's a hierarchy of ranks, and certain ranks are not supposed to mingle with other ranks or fraternize with them, because what it does is it distorts the social structure of the military ranks, and it creates confusion amongst superiors and subordinates, right? So the whites in the coal mine, they were acting in a way to reinforce the societal structure that placed them above the Negroes, right? So they were doing what they were supposed to do. Now from here, let's move on to the bonus scene. Here we go.
The hotel at which I am staying, the American Milberger Smith from New York, proprietor, is a very capital one. I have never, this side the Atlantic, had my comforts provided for better in my private room with so little annoyance from the servants. The chamber servants are Negroes and are accomplished in their business. The dining room servants are Irish. A man and a woman attend together upon a few assigned rooms. in the hall adjoining which they are constantly in waiting. Your bell is answered immediately, your orders are quickly and quietly followed, and your particular personal wants anticipated as much as possible and provided for, as well as the usual offices performed, when you are out. The man becomes your servant while you are in your room. He asks at night when he comes to request your boots, at what time he shall come in the morning, and then without being very exactly punctual, he comes quietly in, makes your fire, sets the boots before it, brushes and arranges your clothes, lays out your linen, arranges your washing and dressing gear, asks if you want anything else of him before breakfast, opens the shutters and goes off to the next room. I took occasion to speak well of him to my neighbor one day, that I might judge whether I was particularly favored.
"Oh, yes,"
he said.
"Henry was a very good boy, very valuable servant. Quite so. Would be worth $2,000 if he was a little younger. Easy."
At dinner, a respectable-looking, gray-headed man asked another,
"Niggers are going high now, ain't they?"
"Yes, sir."
"What would you consider a fair price for a woman 30 years old, with a young one 2 years old?"
"Depends altogether on her physical condition, you know. Has she any other children?"
"Yes, 4.
"Well, I reckon about 700 to 800.
I bought one yesterday. Gave 650.
"Well, sir, if she's tolerable likely, you did well."
Sitting at the table, casually talking about buying and selling humans like people today talk about buying and selling stocks. So you really have to sit back and ponder on the type of mentality that someone has to have in order to do this, right? And on top of that, how this was just a normal, accepted aspect of reality, right? And it's just so far out there and so alien to the experience that we see today that it makes me have to remind myself that this was actually a reality at one time, right? This was not a fairy tale that we're reading about. This is how it really went down. But thankfully, the collective consciousness is always shifting. So no periods of human cruelty, oppression, and injustice last forever, right? Although it must have appeared like an eternity for the victims who lived during that time, right? So think about that as we conclude commentary 234. Now in 235, we're going to take a trip with Olmsted to a slave farm, and we're going to get more into the mind of the slave owners. So you're going to definitely want to stay tuned for that. But right now, what I want to do is thank you for watching all the way into the end. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.